I'm back here with Jason, Reza Jorjani, and we today are going to talk about Atlantis. Yeah, it's going to happen.
It's always a pleasure to be with you, Nikki. And, this is a subject that I'm particularly looking forward to talking to you about, since you've been at a lot of these sites that I think were built by the Atlanteans all across the world.
Yes, if you're referring to all the megalithic awesome ruins, then yeah, I think so too. So yeah, let's get into when someone says, okay, so when someone says Atlantis to me, I'm always I just think it basically means the pre-Diluvian civilization. Like, it's not for me just Plato's account of an island that sunk. But different people have different definitions of what that means for them when they say Atlantis. So if I say to you, like, what's Atlantis, what do you define that as?
Well, I certainly wouldn't limit it to Plato. I think that some of these attempts to identify Atlantis with Minoan civilization based solely on Plato's account or whatever, which aren't even, true to the specific points in Plato's narrative, are absurd. And of course, the people who try to do that don't look at any other source of information on Atlantis besides Plato. So we certainly wouldn't want to limit ourselves to Plato. But at the same time, I don't think Plato should be underestimated as a source for knowledge about this antediluvian civilization, because in Plato, we're really dealing with someone who was, the most prominent initiate of the secret societies of the time. He was a member of the Pythagorean order, which he joined after the death of Socrates. He was from one of the most prominent families in Athens, and he had a family tie to Solon, who was the lawgiver of Athens. And according to his account in Timaeus and Critias, Plato received the manuscript about Atlantis as a family heirloom. So he claims to have actually read Solon's account of Atlantis, which Solon, the lawgiver of Athens, took down based on what he was told by priests at the temple of Neith in Egypt. So there's this Egyptian goddess Neith, which is the analog of the Athenian, goddess Athena, the goddess after which the city of Athens is named. And Solon claimed to have gone to this temple of Neith during one of his trips to Egypt and taken down this account of, this lost civilization. So this is the pedigree that Plato is giving us. And, then we can go into the details of his account and so forth, if you would like.
So I recently read Timaeus and Critias. I can't say words very well, so forgive me if I mispronounce them. But anyway, the point that did stick out to me that was a little bit like, is that they really literally are at a storytelling competition. So you do have to, even within the text, it talks about that. So it's presented as if this one is not fake. This one's real. This is like an actual historical account, but it is at a rhetorical competition. So it's kind of hard to not really mention that at some point. But that aside, I think that there is.
Just make a point about that, if you don't mind.
Okay, yeah, please do.
Just about that one point. So. Okay, not to get into overly detailed subtleties of the philosophical context here, but according to Plato, this conversation in Timaeus that begins in the dialogue Timaeus and then it continues really with the accounts of Atlantis in the dialogue Critias, this conversation between Socrates, who's a kind of dramatic persona for Plato, and these other interlocutors is taking place right after the conversation that they had, which is presented as the dialogue of the Republic. So Plato's text Politeia, or translated as Republic, which is about this utopia governed by philosopher kings, what we would today call like a techno-scientific, authoritarian, technocratic kind of state. This is the conversation that they were having immediately before the one on Atlantis, and Socrates said, or I forget whether it's him or one of his interlocutors says, well, yesterday we were imagining an ideal state. Now let's find a historical example of a society that was sort of governed along these lines. And so there's this explicit contrast made between the imaginative utopia of republic and then the historical account of Atlantis and its attempt to take over Athens, to colonize Athens. So anyway, that's worthy of note insofar as assessing whether it's a story or based on some historical.
It's also really weird that like in Timaeus, like right before he starts like let's Critias talk anything about Atlantis, there's like some like eugenics stuff basically talked about. If you I mean, it's like when he kind of is describing his utopia government system, it's like basically like breeding people. There's a little bit of that in Timaeus, and I was like, whoa, okay, that's.
Well, it's all over republic, and you know, this is not like a minor point. Plato is the first person in recorded literature to propose eugenics. Plato is the father of eugenics, as far as we can tell from, you know, the history of literature. And, you know, so they had eugenics in terms of breeding animals, producing optimal livestock and like racehorses and hunting dogs and so forth. And they had eugenics in terms of botany, cross-pollinating plants and so forth. And Plato's the first person to take those techniques and suggest that they should be applied by let's say authoritarian government, not to say totalitarian, on a human population-wide basis.
Yep. Yeah, and I don't really ever hear that talked about in the mainstream, but that is there. So yeah. Okay, so what do you think about the reason that Plato gives for the destruction of Atlantis, like that the gods just, yeah.
So in a nutshell, and before I launch into this, let me just mention there's one other dialogue that's really relevant here, although most people don't address it when they discuss Plato's Atlantis, and that's the dialogue Cratylus. And in Cratylus, Plato gives an account of how the Olympian gods basically divided the earth amongst themselves. So in prehistory and vast antiquity, the Olympian gods ruled the earth, and we find this myth in every culture. I mean, the Sumerians say the same thing about the Anunnaki at one point directly ruled the earth, and so forth. And the Chinese say the same thing about the Celestials, the Dragon Kings and the Phoenix Queens, and you find it in all kinds of cultures. So Plato in Cratylus talks about how the Olympians divided the earth among themselves, and they basically ruled over humans like, humans were in an animal farm. I mean, it's the Eden idea, basically, that we were kept as almost like beasts of burden and our basic needs were met, but we were toilers, in the fields of the gods. And there was this one territory, though, that was governed by Poseidon. And one of Poseidon's eldest son, Atlas, revolted against this Olympian order on the earth. And so this territory, Poseidia, which later comes to be known by the name of Atlas, Atlantis, the realm of Atlas, this territory basically defies the entire Olympian world order and attempts to break free of celestial governance, and then goes around, from the Olympian perspective, it goes around conquering other territories on the earth. But if you were to look at it from the Atlantean perspective, the Atlanteans might say what they were trying to do was to liberate the earth, the whole earth, from the rule of the Olympians, and basically create a society, where humans will be self-determined and not under the thumb of any overlords. And the interesting thing about Plato's account that then, has echoes in later narratives about Atlantis from people will talk about Rudolf Steiner, Edgar Cayce, and so forth, is that Plato specifically mentions the fact that it's when the Atlantean population began to be increasingly hybridized that they revolted against the Olympians. So there was interbreeding between these gods, the heirs of Poseidon, whatever, and mortals, let's say, okay? Because not to say that one group is human and the other isn't human, but different types of humans. And so there was this interbreeding, which is, interestingly enough, we find in the Bible also in Genesis. I mean, the reason given for the Great Flood, for the destruction of, the pre-Noahide civilization in the flood, is that there was this interbreeding between the quote unquote fallen angels and the humans to produce a race of giants who, were guilty of supposedly satanic pride. And so you see this in Plato's account as well, that it's the hybridization that then leads to a race of demigods or heroes. The word hero in Greek literally means born of eros, between gods and mortals. And so this race of heroes in Atlantis basically gets it into its head that it doesn't need, that they don't need gods above themselves, and that they're going to basically be the masters of their own destiny. And they revolt against Olympus. And they're punished by Zeus, who calls a convocation of the gods and, shatters Atlantis with earthquakes and then submerges the entire planet in a global deluge, again, directly paralleling the flood of Noah.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. So what do you think about the physical location of Atlantis? Do you care?
Oh, I care. I think it's a matter of great controversy. So I think there are only two serious hypotheses. I don't even take the Minoan hypothesis. I think that's ridiculous. People who want to try to reduce Atlantis. I mean, they're as ridiculous as the people who deny evidence of parapsychology and are, materialists. The ones who want to identify Atlantis with the Minoan islands inside the Mediterranean. So let's discard that possibility. Yeah. First of all, let's look at some of the details.
I was reading this one last night, Colin Wilson's, and like at the end it talks about like Atlantis and Cyprus or whatever, and I think that's bogus. But
he doesn't believe that. I mean, Colin Wilson.
No, he doesn't. But he goes into like why he doesn't believe it.
Right. I mean, just to go right out of that. I mean, Colin Wilson's idea, and Colin Wilson, by the way, for people who are just familiar with him from his writings on, psychic phenomena and UFOs and whatever, Colin Wilson was a really serious thinker. I mean, he probably would have conceived of himself as a philosopher. He wrote a lot about, further developing existentialism to be able to account for, incorporate an understanding of the paranormal and so forth. And so Colin Wilson is actually one in a series of philosophers, beginning with Plato, who took Atlantis seriously, others being Rudolf Steiner, and then we got Sir Francis Bacon using Atlantis as a symbol for a utopian society in the Renaissance period. In any case, Colin Wilson took seriously the account of Charles Hapgood and an account that was developed further by Rand Flemeth from Professor Hapgood. And this was the idea that, and by the way, Albert Einstein endorsed this theory of Charles Hapgood concerning Earth crustal displacement. Basically, the notion is that over time, the ice accumulating at the top of the Earth creates a kind of gravitational disequilibrium, and the whole crust of the Earth slips over the mantle like the skin of an orange, from the Earth basically being top heavy with ice. And it causes the continents to move by several thousand miles. And this, according to Hapgood, is the reason why we find the mammoths flash frozen in Siberia with food undigested in their stomachs, because that whole region was suddenly pulled up into the north, closer to the northern pole. And at the same time, a part of Antarctica, Queen Maud Land, and the peninsula that sticks out from it, was pulled downward into the southern polar region from a latitude that would be where Patagonia is today. And so, and there's a few pieces of supporting evidence for this. For example, the ice sheet is not thickest at the center of Antarctica at the South Pole, where you'd expect it to be. The ice is thicker on the side of Antarctica that would have been at the South Pole if Queen Maud Land were sticking out and ice-free. Something like,
Okay, so with this description, it's not quite, because like I always thought, like originally I used to think of pole flips as like north to south, or like, I mean, the whole thing. But then I recently had like this dream where, because I was looking a lot into the wrist shot structure, and like I was like, oh, actually, I think that's a former pole, because they don't really know what caused like the natural formation of the wrist shot structure. Like they don't even think it's a meteorite strike. They don't think it's a caldera. So it's just kind of like this weird anomaly. And then like I've even read scientific papers about how they think it might be like a lot of lightning strikes, which I'm like, okay, but that's a very electric universe sort of thing, which is cool. But anyway, I was like, okay, well, I don't know why, but like I just sort of thought like an aurora borealis could have come out of it at a lot of points. It could have been a pole center at some point, and then that would have been like a 180 flip. And then what's also interesting about the wrist shot structure is the antipode. Is that right? Do you say the antipode? Is that the
antipode? Yeah, antipode.
Antipode, yep. Which is if you pierced like a string right between the circumference of the earth, like they would be on the other side. So is Zealandia, which is actually the biggest continent that we know of that did sink. Which is weird that like that just happens to be where the other end of the world is from it. And so I was thinking like, oh, those could have actually been poles at one point and then switched. But the way that you described Hapgood's thing is, it's not that, I mean, it's some shift, but it's not like a 180 shift.
Well, it depends, because look, we don't know how this, how do you pronounce it? Reshot structure?
Reshot, yeah, I don't know. Yeah. Don't take my authority on how to pronounce anything, but I think it's Reshot structure.
If it was a former pole, we don't know how long ago. It may not have been 180 degrees. It's 180 degrees from where the pole is now. But if Hapgood's theory was that, it kind of shifts around a bunch of times over a long, so we don't know how long ago that might have been the pole. It might have gone through several pole shifts after that before being where it is today, right? So you see what I'm saying? Like the amount of degrees it shifted, it could have been 30 degrees and then 45 degrees and then 15 degrees. So that would fit with this theory if there were a number of pole shifts between that one and the last one that pulled Antarctica all the way into the southern polar region.
Well, and I definitely think that the more I look into all of this, we're dealing with more than one. We're dealing with more than one catastrophe. We're dealing with more than one time that we've been like reset away.
I totally agree. Totally agree. But back to the location of Atlantis, because there's a lot here that we can unpack. So Colin Wilson, coming out of Charles Hapgood's theory, basically makes the point that aside from the fact that you have the ice thicker on the end of Antarctica that would have been at the South Pole for a long time before the last pole shift, you have to look at some of the details of Plato's account. And Plato says that people think island of Atlantis. No. The guy says. No,
he even described it as a continent.
He says it's an island in the world ocean, which is the size of Libya and Asia combined. And if you look in terms of Greek geography, what was Libya and Asia? It's the size of the ancient Persian Empire, basically, which is analogous to the continental United States today. What island do we have on Earth that's the size of the continental United States? Number one, right?
Antarctica.
And secondly, what the hell does world ocean mean? World ocean means where all the oceans of the world become one. There's one place on Earth where there's an island the size of the continental United States, surrounded by only a single ocean, where the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and the Atlantic Ocean become one ocean, the waters around Antarctica. Furthermore, there are these maps that Hapgood points to from the Renaissance period, one by Turkish Admiral Piri Reis, and then there's one by Orontius Phineas, who is a European Renaissance navigator. And these maps are believed to have been copied from older ones in the Library of Alexandria, and who knows how much older, than that. And they show Antarctica ice-free. And the thing is, the contours of Antarctica ice-free on these maps delineates two land masses with a smaller sort of peninsula island separate from a larger one. Well, actually, our sonar, and other kind of mapping technologies that the Navy has used only recently, beginning in the late 20th century, have revealed that that is exactly the structure of Antarctica. subglacial topography of Antarctica. Well, how the hell did they know that when they made these maps? These maps are clearly from a time when either a large portion of Antarctica was ice-free or somebody had the technology to map that continent.
I mean, I was at a antique store the other day looking at a bunch of maps from the 1830s, and they don't even, the world maps didn't even show it. They hadn't even found Antarctica yet. They didn't even show any, there was nothing there basically, or there was like one little part. But I mean, so yeah, it's very interesting to wonder what was going on with that.
By the way, those maps also have accurate longitude and latitude measurements, which shouldn't have been achieved by that time. So it looks like they were copied from older maps that were made by somebody that had advanced naval technology. And one other thing in terms of Plato's account of Atlantis and what Colin Wilson says coming out of Charles Hapgood is that according to Plato, Atlantis had a huge mountain range where at certain places the mountains went down precipitously into the ocean. The other hypothesis about where Atlantis is located is the mid-Atlantic range, you know, from outside the pillars of Hercules, namely the Strait of Gibraltar, from outside that all the way down into the Bahamas, with the Azores being, you know, one part of that, right? But there's no giant mountain range that would have been that far. I mean, there are you know, mountains underneath the ocean.
Yeah,
there's a ridge.
There's beach sand or whatever found. I mean, like there's, even if you raised everything that they think the Azores would have been, I just don't think it's big enough to account for what was described.
Exactly. I mean, Plato is describing something like the Colorado Rockies or the Himalayas. And we have a mountain range like that in Antarctica. The Transantarctic Mountains are exactly that. So it seems to me that the most likely location is Antarctica. However, it's interesting that there have been a lot of finds in the Bahamas area and sort of, you know, between the Bermuda Triangle and the Gulf of Mexico that appear to be megalithic, high precision, vast in scale. Like, for example, this entire megalithic city that was found off the coast of Cuba, I think in 2001 by this researcher, Paulina Zalitsky. And she managed to get the story to National Geographic. It got significant press coverage for like a week and then went completely black. The woman was thrown in a Mexican prison to intimidate her to drop the investigation, and ultimately went back to Canada and refuses to talk about it again. But the sonar imagery is there. This thing is like the size of a city. And it's got several huge pyramids in it. And it's how many thousands of feet, 700 meters underneath the ocean. So figure that. And then, of course, there's the Bimini Road, whose surfacing Edgar Cayce predicted, road, wall, whatever that megalithic structure is. So it seems that there was something in the Bahamas. Now, if the Atlanteans were a global naval power, as Plato describes them to have been, well, it would figure that they would have gone around creating port cities all over the world, including potentially an island chain that stretched between the Bahamas and the Azores at some point, you know, before the sea level rose.
Yeah, I just listen. I'm gonna have this woman on my podcast soon. She's researching giants in Aruba, and their legend is that they were basically kind of like they have a bunch of you know, like the elongated skulls and some giant, they have like 2 giant skulls that they found in there, and there's a bunch of legends of I don't know, like a race of like 9-foot tall giants that were found there that are an offshoot of when the waters rose or something. Like they're basically kind of refugees from the sunken Atlantis in Aruba, around in that area. So it's super interesting. I'm gonna have her on. Her name's Heather Arnold. So that's like pretty interesting. She's done a lot of research on that.
I was just gonna say something about the giants.
Okay.
While we're on that subject. So one question is the historical scope of Atlantean civilization, right? I mean, this was an incredibly advanced civilization from all the accounts that we have. Well, look, the stones speak more loudly than anything else. The level of engineering that we see in the megalithic structures says more than, you know, Steiner or Edgar Cayce or whatever Plato could about the civilization's level of technology. But so then that raises the question, well, how long was the civilization around, right? I mean, if it was destroyed, say 12,000 years ago, and we can go into why Plato's claim that Atlantis was destroyed 9,000 years before his time, or about 12,000 years before ours, might actually hold water. There's evidence involving the pyramids, the Sphinx, and so forth that suggests that that date is accurate. But in any case, how old was Atlantis when it was destroyed? I'm coming around to the question of giants. Edgar Cayce, and this guy, it's worth noting, by the way, I have no particular affinity for this guy. He was some, like, I don't know, whether Southern Baptist, some kind of evangelical Christian, actually, in terms of his personal belief system. So I have no, stake in defending Edgar Cayce, okay? But the fact is that he had an astonishing track record as a psychic healer. He was a really adept medium. And so I think that, his account of Atlantis is at least worth looking at. And what he says is that this civilization underwent several destructions, several successive destructions over the course of tens of thousands of years. And he describes an Atlantean civilization that is, sort of at its zenith, 50,000 years before the present. Well, if we look at human evolution, 50,000 years before the present, there were still Neanderthals on the planet. And there were all kinds of other species that have since been discovered, the Hobbit people, Denisovans. And so we're dealing with a Tolkien-esque world where there were many races of man coexisting at the same time. One of which, and possibly the ruling class of Atlantis, was this giant race with elongated skulls, where everywhere, these Atlanteans seem to have had an impact. Like, for example, among the Maya, they attempted to replicate these elongated skulls artificially in the population. So, I think that's an important point to keep in mind, is that in Atlantis, we're dealing with a sociological, anthropological situation where the idea of race actually means something. Race has been deconstructed in modern anthropology as a concept that doesn't really have an empirical basis. So they talk about ethnicity instead of race and whatever, and say there's only one human race, etc. No, in the time of Atlantis, there were multiple races of man. All right, if Atlantis is 50,000 years old, we're dealing with a very different social situation than, anything we've been exposed to in our recorded history.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm just sort of thinking, like, yeah, there really were like Hobbit people, like giants and all that. Yeah.
And the Hobbit people were dealing with the giants. I mean, they were really giants, right? I mean, imagine the size differential. If we're dealing with, like, I mean, we have 8 foot tall people. We've got basketball players that are 8 feet tall. And if we've got Java men that are 3.5 feet tall, do you imagine the size differential between those two groups when they encountered one another?
Yeah, I mean, like, I like this weekend, like, I had a 7'2" guy come on the plane, and I was like, how tall are you? Like, I was just like, whoa, like it was like a giant. It was interesting. I mean, and like, and that shouldn't be that much, because I'm 5'4". You'd be like, oh, you're only 2 feet taller than me, but it was a big deal.
And the megalithic structures certainly, lend themselves toward the interpretation of them having been built by a race of giants. Not that, giants could move these stones or anything like that. Obviously, they were using some kind of advanced technology, but I mean, look at the scale of these doorways and the size of these blocks and the size of the steps going up to some of these places. I mean,
you want to get me started on megaliths? Because I can get started on megaliths.
No, we should talk about Ollantaytambo, Sacsayhuaman, Tiwanaku. All of these sites are relevant to the question of it.
I mean, really, for me, Sacsayhuaman was like, when I went there in person, I went there on accident, went there, and I was like, I just felt the biggest sense of I've been lied to in my entire life. Like, I had never heard about Sacsayhuaman my entire life, never heard about it in any school situation. I just went there to see Machu Picchu. This was just like a bonus side thing that I went to it wasn't like part of the tour. And I'm walking around there and I'm just like bawling. I'm just crying. I'm alone. And I'm just going like, what the hell happened here? Like, who built this? Like, what's going on? Like, what's really happening? Like, when you see it's like really hard to tell most people about some of this stuff, because they're just like, so what? Like, the Inca built the, like, who cares? Like, It was like a big, and I'm like, you don't understand the size of these things. They're and the precision and the amount of uh the complexity of that. Like you had to, they had some sort of technology that we do not have currently. The stones melt into each other. You couldn't even put a needle into it. I mean, it's I'll put pictures in here of it. But so the thing is then I started digging more and more into a lot of these megalithic structures. They have, it doesn't matter if we're talking about Egypt or Greece or Baalbek, Lebanon, or like, some like quarries in China or like Longview caves or something, or we go over to India and I'm like at like Mahabalipuram, India, walking around, or I'm like in Peru. They have building techniques that are the same globally all the way around. Like one of them is nubs, another thing is like pinch holes. They have like the giant size. There's bevel blocking. There's like this like melting in with each other. There's weird formations. I call them what the fuck boulders. I don't really know what they're really called, but like they're weird structures within actual bedrock. And it's globally found. And then you have different dates, right? You'll be like, oh, well, Saxon woman is only like 1,000 years old, or the Incas built that 1,000, and then like you have to realize that stone cannot be dated. Carbon 14, which is also a bullshit dating method, honestly, but that's for, you could date wood with it, okay? Like it has to be an organic material, but actual stone, they have like some uranium stuff that they've recently come out with, which is also like super stretch when you look at how they actually like are dating the stones and stuff. The margins of error are like too big to even deal with thousands of years, and it just makes you kind of go like, when they date half these sites, you have to throw it away. And that has been like a really hard unlearning for me. But it is something that, like, when you actually just look at the stones themselves and from first principles and don't take what is being said about them and just start comparing them globally, you will, as a connoisseur with a certain painting, how you could pick up on a certain artist, you'll see that there is a way in which these structures are made by the same culture. So
yeah, there's three facets to this megalithic engineering that I just wanted to highlight, just to really drive this home for people, how bizarre this is, and how there's no way that these structures were built by the cultures that they've been attributed to by mainstream archaeologists. One is, of course, the scale of the structures. I mean, if you look at the platform at Baalbek in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, the stones that are uppermost on the platform, meaning they had to lift them above the lower portion of the platform, which is already like, I don't know, tens of feet high, right? So you have these like 40, 50-ton blocks. Again, high precision. You can't slip a razor blade in between the joints. There's no mortar, and you can't even slip a razor blade between these joints, which is what you find in Egypt, what you find in South America. And you've got these 40, 50-ton blocks, and they go up for tens and tens of feet. And they are surmounted by these 1,000 to 1,300-ton blocks that are, they call them the trilithons because there are three of them.
Yeah, one's called the pregnant woman.
They found the quarry for these things because there's one of these trilithons left at the quarry, and the quarry is 50 miles away from the site. And these are 1,000.
And I'll put images, but they can't actually lift that stone today with, like, it would take, like with our current cranes, there would be no way to move it. And
you somehow moved it with like a Hoover Dam size building crane, you would not be able to maneuver it into position that precisely. Okay, assuming you could even move it with like the kind of crane that built the Hoover Dam or something, which, how did they have that thousands of years ago? In any case, one is the scale, and you find the scale in Egypt, you find the scale in South America. Another is the jigsaw pattern of a lot of these blocks. There are as many as a dozen different points of intersection between some of these jigsaw cut blocks and the ones around them, okay? Which means, just think about this for a minute. These people would have had to know in advance where every single stone is going to go. Who the hell builds like that? This is literally like a jigsaw puzzle. You're dealing with, stones in the tens to hundreds of ton range, and each of them has been pre-cut in a jigsaw manner with some kind of an overall master plan of where each is going to be positioned. That's insane. That's not only a higher level of technology, that's a mind that thinks in a completely different way from ours. And then finally, just another last example of how bizarre some of these structures are. You have these stones that curve, where, I'm sure you've seen these in person, where it's like a single stone, which again is cut in this jigsaw way to fit into the ones around it. It curves at the corner of a wall. The one stone itself curves, as if the stone were turned into putty and then shaped. So it seems they had some kind of technology to soften stone and manipulate it like concrete or something.
Yep. I mean, like, these are all things that people talk about and theorize. And yeah, I mean, and I'm going to put images of all this stuff up. And it's weird to me that more people aren't going like, wait, what is going on here? Because it's just in your plain sight nose, like that there's, I mean, I'm not an engineer, I'm not, whatever, but I went there and I'm going like, yeah, okay, well, we can't do this now. It's very weird. But I mean, I am a sculptor and I can sculpt things. And I also think like some of the things that is also in plain sight that we aren't talking about is just the amount of machine tooling that would have had to have gone on, like the identical precision that goes on in some of these sites too, is all supposed to be done with a chisel and a hammer. Okay. Like the drill, the electric drill wasn't invented until 1917. So anything before 1917, including, all of your nation's capitals with their columns and everything, was supposedly all this like identical like stoneworking was done by some wonderful artisans with the chisel and a hammer. Some weird stuff's going on.
Absolutely preposterous. And clearly there was some kind of advanced drilling technology or laser cutting technology involved. And like you said, and as you've shown in a lot of the programs that you've done, it's the same technique being applied in all these different places in the world, from quarries in China to the South American sites in Bolivia and Peru to Giza and Abydos in Egypt. It's all the same engineering technique. And I mentioned Abydos. I mean, the Osirian at Abydos is just something else.
And it looks like it's from Peru. When you're there, you're like, oh, this is so crazy, because it just looks exactly to me the way Peru looks. It's weird.
Exactly. And these propagandists want us to believe that this thing was built underground because, I mean, it's a subterranean temple right now. But assuming, like any sane person would, that this was built above ground, well, it lies under at least 8,000 years of sedimentation, and it's interesting, insofar as, while it's probably the most impressive engineering structure in Egypt, it has no hieroglyphs on it, just like the Valley Temple has no hieroglyphs on its stone, just like the Sphinx Temple has no hieroglyphs on its stone. And we know the ancient Egyptians.
Well, it does have the oldest flower of life, which is acid etched, which is odd on there.
Well, exactly. First of all, that's not a quintessentially Egyptian symbol, and it's more like an Indian. It's more like a tattoo or an imprint than it is a, So, so here's the thing. I mean, the ancient Egyptians were megalomaniacal. The pharaohs, put hieroglyphs all over everything that they built. Why are these sites so austerely anonymous? And in the case of the Sphinx Temple, we know that the Sphinx Temple is contemporaneous with the Sphinx because the blocks were hollowed out from the Sphinx trench when they dug the Sphinx trench and carved the Sphinx. And Robert Schoch showed in the 1990s that the Sphinx has gone through thousands of years of water erosion, which pushes it back to a period when there were heavy rains in Egypt. That was a completely different climate, anywhere from 7,000 to 10,000 years ago in Egypt. And so the Sphinx Temple must be contemporaneous because the blocks are literally coming from out of the same trench. And then, in terms of further corroboratory evidence of Plato's date of Atlantis, Robert Bauval showed how the three pyramids of Giza are in the same alignment as the three stars of Orion's belt. And if you wind back the zodiacal clock to 10,500 BC, you will see a mirroring of the star patterns in the sky onto the Earth, where the three stars of Orion's belt are reflected down onto the Earth in the form of the three pyramids at Giza, and the Milky Way is reflected down onto the Earth as the Nile River in a kind of macrocosm, microcosm structure. And at dawn,
it's not just there, like that's like in Thornsboro
in 10,000.
But that same patterning is found you have it in China pyramids, you have it with like there's these stone circles in northern England called I think it's Thornsboro, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but they also, and to scale the exact, they're stone circles, but they're of Orion's belt, like three of them in the same giant large scale that they would be like how they are in Giza. It's very weird that same copying of Orion's belt, and probably if you outlaid all of the Orion constellation and try to match up where the pyramids or where the structures would go, you'd probably find something in a lot of these places. It's the archaeoastrology stuff is bizarre how universal that is, how global that is.
Yeah, and if anyone wants to believe that that's some kind of coincidence, consider the third piece of evidence that Bauval brought forth, which is that at dawn on the spring equinox in 10,500 BC, if you were standing next to the Sphinx and looking in the same direction of the Sphinx, you would see the sun rise up into the area of the constellation of Leo. And that was, of course, the age of Leo. So there's no way in hell then that the mirroring of the stars of Orion's belt and the pyramids and the Milky Way and the Nile River are a coincidence. This whole ground plan was set up by somebody with masterful knowledge of astronomy and engineering capabilities beyond our own today.
Yes, that's very, very true. Do you think that they are all gone? The Atlanteans are all gone? Because I don't.
Yeah, I definitely don't. And so how to broach this subject? I think that a lot of the secrecy behind the UFO phenomenon has to do with Atlantis. And that the biggest secret is not that the Earth is being engaged by extraterrestrials. The biggest secret is that our history, our recorded history, is a blip by comparison to a tens of thousands of year old history of a spacefaring civilization that was based on this Earth. There was a civilization on this Earth with higher technology than ours, and in some sense, a different technology than ours. And it was completely destroyed. I mean, its surface presence was completely destroyed, and it went underground. It turned into a kind of breakaway civilization. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is the most closely guarded secret for two reasons. One, if we take, the accounts by people like Rudolf Steiner and Edgar Cayce seriously, then the Atlanteans had some kind of anti-gravitic or electrogravitic aircraft. They had these aircraft that were powered by a type of energy technology that has not been allowed into the public domain. I actually think it's the type of energy platform that Nikola Tesla developed, that it's the world wireless system that Tesla schematized and that he actually imagined as a power source for wingless aircraft that are in his designs for the world wireless system, in his sketches. He's got basically these things that look like cigar-shaped UFOs. And so, this is an energy technology that they want to secret away. And that's one reason why we can't be allowed to know about Atlantis. And the other reason, I think, is the population of this civilization had highly cultivated psychic abilities, that this was a civilization where telepathy, clairvoyance, psychokinesis were widespread and well-developed human abilities. And if we're to give any credence to Steiner and Casey, who, as far as I'm aware, had no knowledge of one another and did not influence each other's accounts of Atlantis. I mean, Casey didn't even remember what he said when he would wake up from out of his trances. Steiner certainly wasn't paying any attention to Edgar Casey. So what they both agree on is that this civilization was in part destroyed through the mismanagement of psychic abilities, and that the population was extremely psychic and psychokinetic. So they ultimately engaged in the kind of psychic war against one another. There were these two factions that both of them describe. And if you want to map this back onto Plato, you could think of it as the faction in Atlantis that's still aligned with the Olympians, that's faithful to the gods and their rule over the earth, and the faction that then revolted against the Olympian gods. And ultimately, these two factions engaged in some kind of a terrible conflict with one another, including in the use of psychokinesis. So another reason why Atlantis is the biggest secret is because these psychic abilities would be tremendously destabilizing to the form of society that we have, and rediscovering Atlantis would mean rediscovering and potentially cultivating these latent human abilities.
Okay, so what do you? I say because I agree with that. Okay, so what do you think about the whole Ghislaine Maxwell, Janet Atlantis, like in the hot zone thing? Have you been following dark journalists at all? Like,
I was afraid you would go here. I didn't know whether you really wanted to go here, but we could go there. Yeah. She was just sentenced a couple days ago, as of the time of our recording. And this is another one of those things where, it's just appalling, the discrepancy between the public perception of something and what is actually going on, right? So this woman was a highly competent submarine pilot. She was an adept diver. And when she, repeatedly says that she grew up basically mesmerized by Jacques Cousteau, and his love of the oceans, and basically this catalyzed her desire to explore the oceans. What she's leaving out is the fact that apparently, according to Jacques Cousteau's son, who met with an untimely death in an airplane accident, Philippe Cousteau, according to Jacques Cousteau's son, his father really didn't care about preserving the oceans. His father was really interested in finding Atlantis. That was the quest that consumed his life. And so if this woman is citing Jacques Cousteau as a major inspiration, well, maybe it has to do with Cousteau's quest for Atlantis. Maybe that's also why Jeffrey Epstein's submarine was named Atlantis. Maybe that's why on Jeffrey Epstein's island at St. James, he had a temple with images of Poseidon and Atlas on it. Maybe it's why on his ranch, he's got a garden that basically reproduces the concentric rings of the city of Atlantis as described by Plato. And then there's the whole eugenics angle where, here and there are stories that have gotten through the filter showing that Epstein was very interested in eugenics. He, had certain criteria for the women that were being recruited and solicited, to get involved with him and Ghislaine. And these were eugenic criteria. Let's put it simply, they were eugenic criteria. And Epstein was heavily involved with all kinds of scientists, including geneticists. So it seems like there was some genetics project that he had in mind. And then when we look at Edgar Casey's account of Atlantis, we see that one of these two factions, the faction that Casey calls the Sons of Belial, were involved in genetic experimentation, including hybridization of human and animal genes, and basically, an attempt to produce various types of artificially modified humans, transhumanism in effect.
Yeah. So do you think that maybe like the elite, as it were, that are all honeypot kind of involved with this little circle thing, do you think that they've actually found Atlantis and maybe have connections to the breakaway civilization? Or do you think it's more kind of like how the Mayans were trying to be like them by binding their heads? Do you think they're trying to immolate and trying to become that which is gone? Or, what do you think there is actually there's some real kind of real world connection going on, or you think they're striving for it?
Okay, that's a really deep and complex question. Let me just, before I forget, note one thing in response to how you led into this subject. Before I, get into this much deeper question. You said Janet Atlantis. So for people who are not familiar, apparently, after Epstein was arrested, when Ghislaine was on the run and she left New York City, she used the pseudonym Janet Marshall to get this house up in New England, in the boonies in New England. And Janet Marshall was a bizarre, like feminist, sort of almost sci-fi futurist feminist author who actually went by the name of Janet Atlantis, Janet Marshall Atlantis. So yet again, Ghislaine is connecting herself to Atlantis in some way. And not insignificantly, the man with whom she lived in that house, which according to some people was her husband, Scott Borgerson, I believe. Who, by the way, this guy is like, I don't know, 7 feet tall or something. You should see the pictures of him. Anyway, whatever that means. His expertise was on Antarctica. So here's a woman, she's diving in the Bahamas her whole life.
And she took what's his name? The guy in the wheelchair, the famous
Stephen Hawking.
Yeah, she took Stephen Hawking on a submarine down in the
Atlantis submarine.
In the Atlantis submarine down in the Bahamas.
Right, in the Bahamas. So she's died. Okay, so what are these two places? These are the two hypothesized locations of Atlantis. She's diving in the Bahamas all these years in the Atlantis submarine. Then she marries a guy whose expertise is Antarctica. And basically this guy, Borgerson, he's after deregulating Antarctica. So there can be exploration and exploitation of Antarctica. And he was involved with all kinds of think tanks. All right, so look, put the pieces together, right? Now, but to answer your question, the deeper, more complex question, it goes back to what you asked earlier about whether these Atlanteans are gone or whether they're really maybe the principal actors behind the scenes of world affairs.
Yeah.
I think that, there's something to be said for this notion from Casey, Steiner, even, all the way back to Plato, that there were two principal factions in Atlantis and that Atlantis wasn't only destroyed on account of some natural catastrophe. There was some kind of a war that destroyed the civilization, right? And these are not mutually exclusive hypotheses because right now we already have tectonic weaponry. We have all kinds of weaponry that can emulate natural forces and artificially cause natural disasters or what look like natural disasters, okay? So if there were two factions in Atlantis and Atlanteans went underground or broke away and they formed some kind of breakaway civilization, are there then still two factions in some kind of a conflict with one another? And this is certainly I've written a whole study of the close encounter phenomenon called Closer Encounters that we did 2 shows on.
That's great.
This is certainly the impression that one gets from the close encounter phenomenon is that there are two forces, at least two forces involved here in some kind of an adversarial way.
Yeah.
And so, I don't think it's a reach to suggest that these rebel Atlanteans who were against the heavenly order, the ones who revolted against Olympus, are still around, and that certain human elites globally are attempting to ingratiate themselves with one or another side in this conflict and to basically carve out a role for themselves in a rapid process of transition that we're heading toward, in the context of which, Atlantis is going to be unveiled or resurface. So I think this process is going to be managed by these entities themselves. And there's probably a very deep conflict over how it's going to be managed. And then you have various global elites that either Epstein was, part of or was involved with, who are leveraging the capabilities they have in order to carve out a role for themselves in this process of disclosure, right? So yeah, that's what I would say.
So I never in a million years thought that Epstein would be connected to Atlantis, but then here you are, it's just super weird. So let's talk. Should we talk about our personal experiences with Atlantis stuff?
Sure, why not? Why not? Why don't you tell the story, which I think you've told a few times, but there might be people watching this who will just be coming into your program through wherever this video disseminates. So
Okay.
you had a portal experience.
I had a portal experience, yeah. So I met this Colombian shaman in September of 2019, and I was about to go to Egypt in October of 2019. And anyway, he tells me this story about how, he basically, there's like a portal in Colombia that they call themselves, Manoa is the name of the portal, right? That's the town. And he tells me this story about how, he took this Tibetan monk there, and that the Tibetan monk like got lost from the group, and then he went back, tried to find him, went and found that there was like this animatronic like door with this like machine, and then this giant woman comes out, and she's like 12 feet tall, and she's blue, and her name's Consuela, and she is like, hey, yeah, you're friends with us, he's staying with us, he's been invited, so we're good. And he's like, okay, can I have him tell me that to make sure you didn't like kill him? And she's like, okay, fine, you can come in, but realize that time works differently here and stuff. So he's like, okay, whatever. So then he goes into the door, and he's like basically in like, there's UFOs flying around, there's a bunch of blue giants, naked blue giants basically with tattoos and stuff on them, and he's like, oh, okay. And she gives him a tour, and she shows him the monk, and the monk's like, yeah, deuces, I'm good, I'm staying here. And anyway, so it's a really actually kind of fantastic story. Like, she tells him that we're the fifth age of man, and that the first two were like more, the first two ages of man were like dragons and fairies, and like things that were more etheric, like not as physical as we are. And then the third was like the Lemurians, which were super big giants and were very like connected to the earth. And then there was, she says that these are like what we call them now, but this is not what they would have called themselves. And then even Atlanteans, she said that's the fourth race of man, and that the Lemurians and the Atlanteans were both physical on the planet, and they had a war that destroyed the planet, but that there's offshoots that survived, and they're one of the offshoots, and they're an Atlantean offshoot. And then anyway, he's like, okay, cool, well, stays for 4 hours, and he leaves, and he goes back, and when he gets back, he was gone for like almost a month. And so everybody was freaking out, they thought he was missing and whatever. So this little dude tells me this, and he's not like, first of all, he doesn't even speak English, so I had a translator translating all this stuff for me. But he's like a small little native dude. He's not, and he's in his 70s. He's not, I don't know, he doesn't have an iPhone. He doesn't, I don't know how to explain it. It's one of those things where I don't think he reads all the stuff that I've read. I don't think he doesn't have a computer. This is just his thing, right? So anyway, he gives me this spell. And he says, like, I have a spell that the White Brotherhood of Man gave me. And I was like, I don't know what that is, but okay, fine, cool. So he tells me this, and he says it's a portal opener. It's a spell to open portals. And I was like, okay, cool. And so he gives me this like 1 month before I go to Egypt. So I'm in Egypt, and I find myself alone in the king's chamber. And I never thought that I would be alone in the king's chamber. That wasn't part of the deal. That wasn't part of the thing with my tour. But I was like, oh, okay, cool. So what do you do when you're alone in the king's chamber? I don't know. So I got into the box, and I'm sitting there, and I'm like, I don't want to close my eyes and meditate, because that's just like a waste of my time that I get to be alone in the king's chamber. So I'm like, oh, I'll try that little spell that the dude gave me. Let's see what happens. So I'm like in the king's chamber, laying in the box. I don't cause there's Kafkai, because there was never any bones found in it, and who knows what the hell it really is. Okay. And then so I'm like laying there, and I'm like looking up, and I just start saying the spell over and over again. And then this like thing, it's like this thing starts manifesting from the rocks above me. Like it starts popping out of the ceiling of the king's chamber. And it was almost like, how it never completely materialized, but it had like the triangle skirt like the Egyptians wore, like the pyramid triangle skirt, and then it had like the big headpiece on top of it. And I got scared. I was like, oh shit. And so like I stopped real quick, and then somebody else came in, and it just almost like smoke went and it disappeared. But then I was like, oh, okay. So not in my existence did I think that experience was going to happen to me. And then I didn't really know how to compartmentalize like what the heck that was. So then I was like, okay, I'm going to go to Colombia with that little dude, because he gave me that spell. So I'm going to like, maybe he's not lying about this Atlantis portal. Maybe I'll go there. I go in February. I was there February and March of 2020, like when the world went all Corona crazy. Okay. And I was in the middle of nowhere, like I didn't even have access to a phone or anything for however long I was there. And I didn't see the giants. I didn't get to go into Atlantis, but I did get touched by a unicorn. And I know that sounds super crazy, but I was at this place, and like a couple of people saw fairies and stuff. And then I was walking back to my camp. I'm 100% sober. I don't have any drugs. I'm just eating like water and quinoa. That's like it. And there was 2 other guys with me, and just walking along, and this white horse with the horn like taps me on the shoulder and is like, yo. And we sat there and watched it eat grass for 10 minutes. I didn't do anything magical, but it was a unicorn by descriptions. So all I know is that made me go like, well, maybe he really wasn't lying about this Atlantis offshoot thing. Like maybe there really is something to, well, I definitely think there's something to portals. And I definitely think there is something to these like Tolkien-esque other creatures that coexist like on some sort of dimensional level within our society. I don't know exactly what that has to do with Atlantis, but it's a little bit Atlantis-y. So that's my personal experience. And I've also had, like, as I was telling you before, that I have had some recently, I've been getting more Shambhala stuff, like a lot more like just weird synchronicities of what to look into with that, which is also, you think, a offshoot of Shambhala, might be an offshoot of Atlantis. So, all right, Tag, you're it.
So before I say anything about my own experiences, there's a handful of remarks I want to make just about your account. First of all, as fantastical as some of the things that this little guy told you may sound to people, one thing that has to be borne in mind is that this quality of narrative is very much the same kind of thing that we get from the contactees in the 1950s, and very much the same kind of thing that we get from people in the Middle Ages who supposedly spoke to fairies and, to the gentry and so forth, and whose accounts were recorded in church chronicles. Jacques Vallée has done an extensive study of this in Passport to Magonia. And if you really dig into the contactee phenomenon in the 1950s, you find out that it was a legit phenomenon. That doesn't mean that the people who were involved in it weren't being screwed with in terms of what they were being told. And, one of the things about the fairies that was notorious in the Middle Ages and earlier epochs is that they were known to be pathological liars, tricksters, who would tell people all kinds of fantastical things, and often accounts that contradicted one another. So it's important to separate the content of a narrative from the structure of the experience.
Agreed.
That's important. And then the second thing is that in terms of the content of the narrative, a lot of what this guy, relatively, as you put it, uneducated guy, uneducated to the point where his authenticity and honesty are very compelling, right? It's kind of salt of the earth person who doesn't really have access to the resources to make up a story like this. A lot of the content of his narrative echoes what is in theosophical texts, in Helena Blavatsky's accounts of the various successive races of man, some of which was adopted by Steiner's anthroposophy. And so one other thing you find in the history of close encounters, and particularly encounters with these humanoid, like elven fairy types, is that they will they will spin a yarn for someone based on the cultural knowledge of the time. So if theosophical ideas are in the air, they might use the language of theosophy to, convey certain information, okay, to somebody. So that's another thing that should be borne in mind, is that, details of this account, you could get some of them from out of Blavatsky, and I'm sure this guy wasn't reading Blavatsky. But okay, it's a sort of like cultural lingo that's being appropriated by the people on the other side of this phenomenon. Then a third thing is, in terms of the unicorn, Casey says that one huge problem faced by Atlantean civilization, and perhaps one of the reasons for the scale of the megalithic engineering, is that the Atlanteans were, believe it or not, he says the Atlanteans were being overrun by gigantic prehistoric beasts. That there were these behemoth creatures running around, and like they posed an actual threat to civilization, and some of them were aerial creatures, and they had to devise some plan to exterminate these things. And so, what occurs to me immediately is that there were still dinosaurs around. Maybe some had survived the mass extinction. And then I could well imagine, like we've come up with the Jurassic Park scenario, right? In our science.
I've started to really think, like I have some dinosaur bones that I've dug up and things that, I think they're dragons, dude.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
No. This is where I'm going with this, is that we have in all these Indo-European cultures, whether it's European medieval culture or whether it's the ancient Iranian culture, we have all these accounts of dragon slaying as some kind of a rite of passage and ritual of heroes. And I have to wonder, how old is this tradition of dragon slaying, right? And then you have close encounter reports where these tall Nordic-looking beings with, the platinum blonde hair and everything, they're wearing these bodysuits that have a symbol of a feathered serpent or winged serpent creature on them. And I really wonder whether, the dragon wasn't an actual creature that existed at the time of Atlantis, and that it was integral to the humanoid civilization in a culture, in a symbolic, ritualistic sense, and that maybe there was a rite of dragon slaying having to do with what Casey was saying about how these beings were a menace, but then also beings that are hunted like that become totemic, right? You see this in all kinds of shamanic cultures. There's a reverence for what is hunted and the spirit of what is hunted, and which then goes to the Chinese veneration of the dragon, right? So the unicorn is similar to that. The unicorn is this other being like the dragon, which was revered, in sort of esoteric European cultural circles with all these like Renaissance tapestries of unicorns and so forth. Right. And so if dragons, then, why not unicorns? And maybe this is also something that goes back to Atlantis. And then what was it? There were a couple other things that I wanted to say about that, but they're escaping me. Anyway,
I totally think and also there's a lot of there's a lot of dating issues with dinosaurs. Like, for example, I know a lot of creationists think this and stuff, but I recently went to like where all the dinosaur footprints are, like outside of Dallas, and they find like there was a talk I saw, I can't remember the geologist who was talking about this, but it was like there's a lot of muscle tissue that's found within the bone that really shouldn't exist millions of years later. So, and there's not just one or two examples, like there's a big thing with that. So I think we might have a lot of the dating within like dating and everything. It just ends up pissing me off when you really get into like you give them an inch and they take a mile with it, and they cover so much stuff up with millions and billions of years. And it's sometimes I'm going like, I don't really think we'll have like a knuckle of a dinosaur and a bat and a vertebrae and a tooth. It's like there's very few full examples of the full skeletal range. Like a lot of it is inferred or like made up by an artist essentially, and even what the outside of them looked like or this or that. It's like there's more to the story than than what we like. Jurassic Park has really been a ginormous brainwashing thing for us. I love it, but it still is a yeah. Anyway, but yeah, dragons, totally. I'm starting to think, yeah, they're real.
One of the things that complicates all the dating, and I don't want to go deep down in this rabbit hole right now, we've already been going for a long time, and we've talked about it in a couple of other, other shows that we've done together, is time travel. Because if time travel is involved here, then the dating problem becomes even more, acute, right? I mean, because look, it's one thing to think, okay, individual, discrete, isolated time travelers going back and forth between various epochs. But if there are huge spatiotemporal vortices on the Earth, like the Bermuda Triangle, which, by the way, is located right where one of the hypothesized sites of Atlantis is, if there are these huge areas where, I mean, there have been bizarre accounts of people going into the Bermuda Triangle and all of a sudden they see a landmass and they register it on sonar and whatever, and then the thing disappears, right? So who knows what could be shifting backwards and forward through time and then contaminate the geological strata as a result of that? That's another question. And so it could be that, this is a hard idea to wrap one's mind around, but it could be that the technological sophistication and almost futuristic quality of Atlantean civilization is on account of the fact that Atlantis was a civilization seeded into prehistory by people from the future.
Ooh, I like that.
So, which I guess if, I briefly want to say a few words about my own kind of personal experience and intuitions on this subject, they began in my sort of, I guess I would say, adolescence, not even teenage, adolescence into early teenage years, where I would get these vivid impressions of a whole metropolitan society, I guess you could say, that was the future past. I mean, this term kept coming to me, that this is the future past. And it was archaeofuturistic. It was like there were Stone Age elements to it, but it was also futuristic in some way. Like imagine Flintstones world, combined with like the Jetsons. It had elements of both in a very bizarre way. And, I started to see this place in vivid detail and have specific memories that, had to do with it. And these are things I've laid out if people are interested in my novel, Faustian Futurist. And in a non-fictional sense, it informs some of what I wrote about Atlantis in Closer Encounters. But more of the detailed recollections are captured in some of the narrative of Faustian Futurist. And just to give a few examples of the kinds of, quirky things that I saw, it was a civilization that had electricity. It used electricity or some kind of electrogravitics for these hovercraft that went through the skies, but it had no electric lighting. The lighting was based on some phosphorescent stone technology. So there were these stones that
Pays the electricity.
What was that?
Like pays the electricity. Like if you stress a quartz crystal, like or if you like rub quartz together, like it'll produce like an electricity, or they use that in our phones and stuff like that. It amplifies stuff, but pays the electricity is a way that which you could probably light stuff with.
That's very interesting. So just in response to that, right? I don't know. And this is the thing about all these recollections is that, look, I have a very active imagination. I can come up with all kinds of things imaginatively. And as someone who's, worked with philosophy, I can come up with all kinds of rationales for things too. But these experiences have the quality of memories. They're extremely fragmentary glimpses. And so when you ask me, is it piezoelectricity? I really don't know. All I can tell you is what I saw. That's interesting. That makes a lot of sense. And I'm going to go look into that. But point being, like, I could speculate and I could, spin out some kind of yarn, but it's very easy for me to tell the difference between that kind of imaginative state of mind and like intellectual rationalization on the one hand, and then the inherent quality of these experiences on the other hand. One time, by the way, I tried to do past life regression hypnosis, and the woman was a total charlatan. This was in my 20s, and I was actually interested in trying to, get some more depth and detail around these fragmentary recollections that I had. And she started like trying to get me to spin some whole narrative, and I just basically walked out of the place because I could see she was trying to implant things in my head, ideas in my head. But bottom line is that these things have the quality of memory. And what I remember is that they used these phosphorescent stones or crystal, whatever, on platforms. So they were spherical on platforms to light huge like squares. And they had smaller ones embedded into the sides of walkways and stairways, so that the overall effect was that in this megalithic city, and the city was megalithic, the construction style was megalithic, but like on the scale of Manhattan, a metropolis built megalithically, so that because of this phosphorescent stone was being used for lighting instead of electricity, there was no ambient glow. And you could see the stars at night as clearly as you could see them out in the middle of the desert in our world or on top of a mountain. Awesome. So imagine like living in a city like Manhattan and being able to go out and look at the stars as clearly as you can see them in the middle of nowhere in our world. And I mean, I won't go on at length, but another one of the striking things here was that, I could see this was clearly a highly stratified society. There was some kind of a caste system in place, and it was a racially correlated caste system, so that, we were talking earlier about these different races of man that may have existed tens of thousands of years ago. And so there were different types of humans who were in different rungs of society based on the role that they played. So there was like a collective sense of identity rather than an individual sense of identity. But, and most of my memories hinge on this. There was some kind of a rebellion that was revolving around the idea of developing individuality and dismantling this caste hierarchy to create a new form of human society that would basically afford a person more free will and self-determination. So there was like a huge ethical, spiritual struggle at the heart of this civilization over individuality versus collectivism, over whether our lives are governed by celestial forces or whether we're to be self-determined. I mean, there was some huge conflict involving that. And, so anyway, if people are more interested or interested in more details about it, they can look at, what I wrote in Faustian Futurist. But let me end by just saying, like, this was not Donovan's Atlantis, okay? Like, it was a dark world. And I saw mass slavery. I mean, there was like brutality and oppression on a scale that, even considering examples like Rome and Assyria, we can hardly imagine today. So yeah, let me leave you. And of course, that's relevant because if in the next 30 years or so, as part of this UAP disclosure or whatever, Atlantis is also going to be unveiled as a historical reality, well, we're going to have to confront on a sociological and ethical level whatever that world was, right? And we're in danger of being awed by it and of being captivated by that and falling back into the type of society that we have been and that I think some people really, fought to the death to overthrow and overcome.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Like, I mean, and I think that it's one of those things where it doesn't matter if it's an angel or a demon or an alien or a fairy. Like, the thing is like there is like this sort of natural proclivity to be like in awe of something that isn't you, and that's like, like, oh, this is above me somehow. But really, you have to come back to the notion of like, even if there was something that created you, what created the thing that created you? Like, there isn't, like, even if we are somebody's science experiment, it at some point it has to be like you don't owe your parents anything. At some point you have to be like, hey, the thing we have in common, Mr. Fairy, is that we're both here at this right now. And that is, so don't ever give your power away to any prevailing thing that comes in. That's just, and I think that, like, especially with like Project Blue Book and some other things coming in with, like, I think that might be in the cards for humanity, as, and like something kind of tries to come and take us over, but that can't happen.
Let me just riff off of that for a minute. What you're describing there, is a kind of direct intersubjective insight, and kind of communion between people, and on a level that cuts through the dichotomy between the conscious mind and the subconscious mind. And that kind of practice is really emphasized by the Dzogchen tradition in what we conceive of as Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism. But in Tibet, they say that Dzogchen practice comes from Shambhala. And it was something preserved by the older Bon religion of Tibet before Padmasambhava came there and brought Buddhism and so forth. And then it was appropriated by Buddhism, right? And I wouldn't be at all surprised if, as you suggested earlier, this kind of reconceiving of the relationship between individuals and the potential it has for restructuring society is something that was being developed in Shambhala by an offshoot of Atlanteans who had fought against that repressive hierarchical caste society. That, when Atlantis collapsed, you had various groups of Atlanteans going into enclaves in various parts of the world. And one of them, I think, was in this area between the Western Gobi Desert and Tibet, somewhere in there, in the Tian Shan Mountains, near the Taklamakan Desert, somewhere around there, between the Taklamakan and the Gobi Deserts. And that a lot of the esoteric teachings of what we think of as Vajrayana Buddhism in Tibet today and in Mongolia come really from this fountainhead that is preserving a rebel Atlantean practice, not to say tradition.
Cool. All right. Is there anything about Atlantis that we didn't cover?
I'm sure there's a ton, but we don't want to exhaust the viewers. I think, we probably are maxing out people's attention span. And it's been a tour de force, I think, overall.
Yeah. So yeah, if you guys have any comments, questions, or any other Atlantis stuff, like, let us know. We like to look at it. So Jason, this was awesome. I had so much fun again. So
always a pleasure, Nikki. Always a pleasure. And I'm looking forward to the next one. There's so many topics we'll talk about.
We'll do this again. Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. Bye.